The Black Anglo-Saxon, your favorite neighborhood political scientist. Welcome to another episode of From the Hood to the Hill. Today we are going to be having a more lighthearted conversation. Yesterday, me and a lady got a chance and the opportunity to go see the movie Odyssey, which is a epic movie for an epic. And if you aren't familiar, this comes out of the Greek mythology canon, originally from Homer. And so what we have is Christopher Nolan's interpretation of said movie, which I think he did a really great job. I think it was very well put together. I think the cinematography was nice. And I also think what brings us here today, the monologues and the dialogues that happen within a movie that gives it its context and framework was very, very, very well done. And so, if you don't want to hear any spoilers, I doubt that I get into any really, because if you are familiar with Greek mythology, you'll be familiar with a lot of these topics already. I think Christopher Nolan leaned into the idea and the fact that most people will come into this movie even have read the books or actually just being very familiar with the tales that have been told. So with that being said, I wanted to have this conversation about how the Trojan horse of this Trojan war and the way that it was used and the way that it was weaponized has a parallel to how we see the erosion of the social contract. So civilization depends upon shared conventions, right, that allow people to make themselves vulnerable to one another. And the Trojan horse was weaponized in one of these conventions, right? The expectation was that it was a gift, a sacred offering. And that was like the Zeus's code that I speak to. And so it was a gesture of peace, right? But what Odysseus did was he took it upon himself and created a whole new blueprint, created a whole new playbook in how he used it as an act of aggression, right? So on the front end, it was genius. It was awesome. It was wonderful. He won the war by exploiting the accumulated trust of what Zeus's code was built upon on. But the broader cause, right, was that the future or in the future, every gift becomes more suspect. Every human interaction becomes more suspect. And it is the thing that we see when we talk about the erosion of trust in American institutions, in American interactions, the over monetization of each and every piece of life that we see ourselves engaging with. And it comes from this exploiting or exploitative mechanism that is folded into modern institutions or capitalism, which is an institution in itself, but how these things create frameworks that win for the now, but cost us in the future because it leaves the cost and it leaves the burden and it erodes the foundation for those of us who depend or vulnerable to power or institutions of power and leave us in a place where we have to second guess. And on the face of it, that nature of second guessing things is not or doesn't come off as insidious. But when you accumulate it over time and when you scale it up, you get a nation of people who literally cannot interact, cannot build. That is the broader cause. And so y'all hear me talk about game theory all the time. And the Trojan horse represents a profitable act, and it goes to the Greeks who received the immediate benefit, and then everyone living thereafter inherited the cost of the transaction, right? So I want to make a necessary distinction though, because Zeus's law is not something that was originally in the um Homer interpretations of the Odyssey. That is something that was added in. But it being added in is very helpful to understand this concept of what the social contract is, because the social contract is basically Rousseau's assessment. So Rousseau's social contract creates an association, right, in which each person places itself in power under the direction of the general will being the will of the state, receiving every other member as part of the political whole, right? So you have in this scenario, you have Odysseus, who is leader of Ithaca. He is going into the Trojan War. His warriors are a part of the first layer of this wheel. And then the whole environment around Zeus's code is the political whole, because Zeus's code is going to govern not just Ithaca, but it's going to govern the Trojans, right? Because this is what's going to end up eventually making us susceptible to the attack in the first place, or rather the deception. So the compact is supposed to protect each other while people preserving a form of collective freedom, right? So it allows us to operate in a space where everybody has freedoms, but you have that not knee jerk, but that implicit understanding of the do's and don'ts of the society. Like nobody's gonna walk down the street and just punch you in the face just off the strength, because it's the expectations set by the society. So when you do that, you become an outlier or an outcast, because also in the movie you'll see another example where you have the gentleman hit the beggar or the homeless person, and everybody in the space shuns him as a result, and they say that's not Zeus's code. You have to treat them with a certain level of dignity and respect. But that's what the social contract is, and that's the parallel in between these two concepts. So Rousseau is especially relevant because the rights of citizenship without fulfilling duties of that subject is the problem and the issue, right? Because if that behavior becomes widespread, that's when we have a problem. It's not an issue when we talk about one particular person doing these acts. Because, yes, I hear and I know the argument that, oh, well, one person does a thing and people are bad. And yes, we understand that there are bad people. We understand that there are people who want to do bad things. But when you break that fabric, when you break that structure, when you break that relational understanding of this is what we're doing, this is what we're not doing, all of those things begin to crumble. And this is Odysseus. He didn't just hide people into this thing, which I gotta what we have to understand is that he hid war in the language of peace. The horse is supposed to be peace. So when he did it, he broke everything that is peace. And we could use a modern example when we look at our politicians, when we look at our politics, and when we see how people have operated, when we look at the e-files, and when we look at all of these different things, our president who has some odd number of felonies, there were supposed to be consequences, right? And now we're on the other side of it, right? The consequences were supposed to be there. But because the social contract, Zeus's code, has been broken, we now see it unraveling of just debauchery up and down a ladder. Because why do I have to abide by certain laws, certain codes, certain standards to uphold myself to be an upright person when everybody who wins is at the top? Everybody who wins is exploiting peace in the name of war, right? It's deceptive. And so the Trojan horse is deceiving the understanding. It is all deceptive behavior because they did not convince them to, well, they didn't defeat Troy, by, let me say it this way, they didn't defeat Troy by overcoming Troy in the sense of making it past its borders because Troy is entrenched, right? They would have never won. They would have never got there in the first place to have that battle, and they probably would have lost. But what they did was they convinced them that the walls were no longer necessary. They convinced them that it's done, it's over, here's a peace offering, and we good, right? And now the Trojans' willingness to recognize that, oh, all right, cool. This is how we operate. This is what we've agreed upon. This is the standard. This is the land of the law. This is the political whole. Now, when you do that, so all of this stuff has to be reciprocal, right? We all have to give and take in these systems for these systems to work. And that was the overarching lesson, right? And him having to, and this was another lesson that came out of the movie in terms of him understanding and having to stop and slow down and recognize, because you'll hear people say the sea people, right? They're breaking down the law, they're breaking down everything we know and understand as civilization. And what you have to understand when they use that word civilization, they're using it in the context of being civilized under the law, civilized under the code, civilized under institutional frameworks and parameters that protect a body of people and peoples and nations. Because we all are operating under the fact that, all right, cool, you don't do this, I don't do this. Another example of that being you have you had law, right, where nobody was supposed to drop nuclear bombs on anybody. But what does America do? America drops a bomb on Hiroshima. You broke code. And I don't know, you know what? Correct me. It wasn't in place at that point. It came after the fact. So you put it in place after the fact, which is even more diabolical. But all of these things have to be reciprocal, is the point. And when Odysseus stops and slows down, you have to understand that that is what allows him to reflect. It's why I always say that we have to stop moving fast nowhere, because moving fast does not get us forward progression. We can be literally moving fast and backwards to our own demise, because just having something move is not the goal. We want to move forward. And in this case, Odysseus moved civilization backwards. Because after breaking Zeus's code, the land became lawless. And he comes back and he has these suitors, these men of shame. And he has all of these people who are operating without any standard, without any code, any value. Because you can also use that word interchangeably. Value. Your values. What are your values? What do you stand on? What do you live by? And I thought that this was a very important conversation, because outside of red party, blue party, rich, poor, black, white, America has no values at its core. When you hear me talk about the American ethos is a valueless ethos. It is a ethos that exists without any social contract at this point. It is an ethos that thrives on debauchery. It is an ethos that literally uh uh perpetuates its systems or encourages its systems, like capitalism, for example, to have a protocol that is maximum extraction, pay no mind to the cost down the road. pay no mind to the cost that the human capital that is being extracted from is literally losing its life force every day, to the point that we have to figure out ways to monetize every point in every facet and every step of our life because it has nothing left to extract. So now, because we live in a contractless environment, we move to AI, not to be confused with tools that are AI. But you know what? I'm sorry. We move to AGI, not to be confused with AI, because AGI and super intelligence is where we're going to go off the rails. And artificial general intelligence, for anybody, the difference is, think about Google being AI, but the Google or Chat GPT, anything with the name Siri, Claude, those are AGIs that basically produce thought, that basically accompany thought with tasks and produce general information and thought, right? Which is very, very different. But we are here now because we're dealing with a society that does not have any guardrails or any reciprocity in it, in terms of what we are agreeing on that we will and will not do as it relates to people trying to rise to the top and rise through the ranks, because we are in a moment where anything goes, especially if it can be deemed legal, because legal is not always the same as ethical. And again, I don't know if that was done intentionally, but the name of the place that Odysseus is coming from is called Ithaca, which I would presume that, you know how they do, it would be a place that he's residing from called, and has and embody ethics. Maybe, maybe not. It's a stretch. I don't know. But when I listen to them talk about Zeus's code, the standards, the values, and all of that, that's kind of where I place the name of the place, of the nation, right? And doing that was the fall of Greece. Doing that was the fall of the Rome, Greco-Romans. You can, because I know people get real technical, but whichever one you want to use, that was the fall. It had more to do with the values or the lack thereof than it does to have with the technical aspects of anything that goes on with red, blue, black, white, woman, man, dingling, coochie, all that stuff is irrelevant. It is the ethos. It is the actual undergirding of the ethics. But if y'all have seen the movie, leave a comment. Let me know what you thought about the movie. And yeah, we'll chop it up.